Hi Bio 111 students, and welcome to week 8, chapter 8. The topic this week is photosynthesis. First, let's define a few terms so that we can understand them. So first off, we'll define the term autotroph. And you notice the word troph refers to trophic level, or what stage in the food chain you're consuming at. And an autotroph, the term auto, meaning automatic or does it itself, refers to the fact that plants are able to manufacture their own food. And it does this through photosynthesis, which is converting carbon dioxide and light into food. The other term I want you to understand is heterotroph. Autotroph is at the very bottom of the food chain. The next thing up is the heterotrophs, and that is all the rest. And we are all different levels of consumers. So you have primary, secondary, tertiary consumers, and that is everybody else is a heterotroph. The autotrophs are plants. They can produce energy and food themselves, so they don't have to eat something else. So, photosynthesis, this reaction I'm about to show you, is the basis for all life on Earth as we know it. Because we are all carbon-based life forms, and the fixation of carbon is necessary for all of us to exist. So, foundation of life on the planet, and I'm going to give you the And as we just talked about there, in any food chain, there has to be a start, there has to be a basis, and it's usually the autotrophs that form the basis of all food chains. So we see this. 6 molecules of CO2 plus 6 molecules of water, and we will put light energy. This is necessary for this reaction to take place. So we'll put a photon of light energy, or light energy is measured in photons, so it's probably more than one. And we get out of that glucose, C6H12O6, plus, very importantly for life on our planet, as well as providing food, this is where our oxygen comes from. So without this reaction, we don't have life on Earth. I also want you to note that this oxygen over here, it comes from the water. So water splits, and the splitting of water is what gives us the oxygen over here. So we were talking a little bit about light energy, and I want you to imagine this. Here is a molecule of chlorophyll, and we have light energy coming down. Let's say 1 photon of light energy. And what that does is it causes electrons on the outer shell of the chlorophyll to become excited. And that energy change from the photon of energy to the electrons becoming excited leads to an electron transport chain. And this all happens in a thing called photosystem 2. I want you to note at this point that photosystem 1 and photosystem 2, it actually all starts at photosystem 2. They're named that just in the order of the discovery by people. It has nothing to do with the order of operations. Stuff happens in photosystem 2 with a photon of light coming in, and then it goes on to photosystem 1, and then goes into the Calvin cycle. So, when we're talking about chlorophyll, let's talk about where we can find chlorophyll. Chlorophyll resides on the membrane of a thing called a thylakoid. It's a disc-like structure, and it's green. So the color green tells us that green is reflected, and because that's what we see reflected back to us, other colors are absorbed. So there we have a thylakoid. Let's write that down. Some people say thylakoid disc. You could call it that. And that's to remind them that they're disc shaped. And then they're usually found in stacks. And a stack of these is called a granum. And or a grana, I should say. So a stack of thylakoids is called a grana, and they are surrounded by a fluid called stroma. So we have stroma outside and in between the discs. And all of this, and you've lots more stacks around it, are all contained in a structure called the chloroplast. So, from smallest to largest, thylakoid, grana, stroma, the fluid that's surrounding it, and then the chloroplast, which is the organelle that contains all of the chlorophyll containing thylakoids. So, the highest energy is the shortest wavelength of light, and the shortest wavelength of light is found at the blue end of the spectrum. So we're going to get the most energy for our chlorophyll out of the blue end. Blue-violet end. Lowest energy is the red infrared end. And we might as well say no energy because of the reflection of green light. We'll be right in the middle, green. Because if you remember, Roy G. Biv, one of those ways that you might remember, red, orange, yellow, green in the very center, blue, indigo, violet. So the blue end with indigo would be the high energy end, and the low energy end is the red end of the spectrum, the visible light spectrum. So let's talk about light dependent reactions. So we talked about photosystem 1 and photosystem 2. PS2 is a light dependent reaction, and this is where it all starts, and then it moves on to PS1. And this can only happen when we have light present. So one of the things that I want to make very clear to you is, in the old days they used to call these light reactions, and then the other ones they call them dark reactions. Well, that's not the case actually, because the dark reactions, well, what was formerly known as the dark reactions, happened any time. It could happen in the presence of light or without light. So then they started calling it light independent reactions, and you know, they decided that wasn't a great idea too. So now they just said they just call it the Calvin cycle, and that's it. And things are much easier since then. So photosystem 2 has antenna proteins, I should say, that are able to capture light energy, and they are surrounding a reaction center. So we might draw it like this, and have this be a channel in the center. This is the reaction center, and we have antenna proteins that are ready to grab hold of that solar energy for conversion to light energy. There's a light harvesting complex that passes this we hear that passes energy along to the reaction center, we talked about it's actually passed in the form of electrons. So this is where our electron transport chain starts. And I want you to notice something. When we were looking at that reaction earlier, some of you might have noticed that this is the other way round from the reaction for cellular respiration. Instead of starting with sugar and oxygen, we started with CO2 and water. And those are the products in respiration, those are the reactants in photosynthesis. And so that's where the backwards stuff starts. And it also starts with the very end of cellular respiration is their electron transport chain, and here we see it at the start of the photosynthesis reaction. So we have an electron transport chain here, and the electrons actually came from water molecules being split by solar energy. So again, similar to the cellular respiration where you have H2O at the end of the electron transport chain, here we're seeing at the very beginning the water molecules being split by solar energy, and we have O2 production at the very start. Of the photosynthesis reaction, instead of at the very end like in cellular respiration. And what happens is lots of protons are generated by the splitting of water, and the proton is basically a H plus ion, and a concentration gradient builds up, and this is more like photosynthesis, photosystem 1, where we have a concentration gradient of hydrogen molecules inside, and we have the generation of ATP when these in the membrane, when these hydrogen atoms move out, sort of like a facilitated diffusion, because they are moving through a protein, and each time a hydrogen proton moves through this ATP synthase, an adenosine diphosphate becomes an adenosine triphosphate. So we're making ATP here. So this is called chemiosmosis because it's a chemical process where the flow of hydrogen ions is creating ATP as the hydrogen ions pass through ATP synthase. So now let's talk about the Calvin cycle. These were formerly called the dark reactions. Now it's just called the Calvin cycle. And again, you might notice some similarity between respiration and photosynthesis. This is like respiration going backwards because we have a cycle after the electron transport chain instead of the electron transport chain being at the end and a cycle before it. So they take place in the presence or absence of sunlight, and CO2 enters stomata, diffusing into mesophyll cells. So we have the mesophyll cells of the leaf. And we have stomata, the openings. As CO2 enters, let's get a diagram of this cycle. So CO2 enters and for each 3 molecules of CO2, we have a molecule called, we have a compound called rubisco, which is ready to absorb 3 CO2s at a time. And this is the entrance to the Calvin cycle. So, and then we go on through a series of steps, and carbon is fixed during the Calvin cycle. And that's really all you need to know for the purposes of this class. There is a diagram in the book, but you don't have to necessarily memorize that diagram. So I do want you to know that CO2 enters the stomata, diffusing into the mesophyll cells. I do want you to know that ATP from the previous light reactions, that's photosystem 1 and photosystem 2, is used by the Calvin cycle, but quite a bit is not used by the Calvin cycle, but it is used by the Calvin cycle to fix CO2 and finally produce our glucose molecules. So PS1 and PS2 are the light reactions, and I want you to know that the light or dark Calvin cycle works. O2 production, oxygen production happens in the light reactions, because we saw the molecule of H2O being split at the very start. And the splitting of H2O equation looks like this. We have 2 molecules of H2O, and what we get out of it is 2H2 plus O2. And the rate of photosynthesis, let's talk a little bit about that. The rate of photosynthesis is affected by how how much water is moving through the plant. And some of the things that affect that are if the stomata in the leaves are open widely, then we have a lot more oxygen able to move through the plant, and transpiration is the driver of the rate of photosynthesis. So we have temperature. Higher temperature increases it, lower temperature decreases it. So what we've got to remember is higher, lower. So, and you can just think about this when in the middle of winter, even with the evergreen trees, there's very little photosynthesis going on because the temperature's not right. Light intensity is very much the same. More intense light means a greater density of photons, and the more photons of energy you have coming in, the better the photosynthesis rate. So that will also increase the photosynthesis. Light color. As we said before, light color, blue is best. Red, not so great. And green, forget about it, it's just reflected. So our highest rate will be with the blue end of the spectrum. And then, because at the very start, one of the things that we need at the very start of this reaction is CO2 concentration. And let's just put that here. Now, the more CO2, the more carbon you have available to make into glucose. So more carbon to be fixed, as they say, into glucose means that the reaction rate will increase. So less carbon dioxide, lower reaction rate, lower temperatures, lower reaction rate, less light intensity, lower reaction rate, light color. If we went red, that would be a lower reaction rate. If we went with green, no reaction rate. And that's all I have for you. Enjoy your midterm break, and don't do what I wouldn't do. Thanks.